All right. Well, we're happy to welcome Steven Waldman with us today. I first met Steven last year in New York City at a forum on faith that it was kind of an interfaith gathering. Steven was on a panel that McKay Coppins was kind of hosting, and it was really good, just what they went through. Uh, I'll read you his bio really quick. He's the founder and president of Rebuild Local News. By the way, we're meeting with Burke here in a week or so to talk more about this because I think it's important. He's also the co-founder and former president of Report for America, a national service program that places journalists in newsrooms across America. Before becoming an advocate for local journalism, Waldman was a journalist covering national politics for, and get these names, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, and Washington Monthly. Later, he wrote a report for the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, outlining the information needs of communities. And again, I'll leave it on a personal note. So one of our sister companies here at Deseret News is called Radiant Digital. Right now it's located in Virginia, but they do a lot in the fleet-based space. And before it was Radiant Digital, it was BeliefNet, and Patheos is kind of a partner now with that. But Steven was one of the two founders, is that right, Steven?
Mm-hmm.
Of BeliefNet back in the day. That was was it the 90s? Early 2000s?
1999.
Okay. Anyway, Steven is a rare find. We're grateful he's with us today. We're going to give him time to tell his story, and then again at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. Over to you, Steven.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it. It's great to be with you. I'll just talk for a little bit about the sort of my professional and faith journey, and then we can just open it up for conversation. It's been a bit of an unusual pathway that I've taken, but I should say it started off with college journalism. Actually, it started off with junior high and high school journalism, to be more precise. That was and my student journalism days were actually very formative. I remember vividly the first story I did, which was a piece for the junior high newspaper about the junior varsity football team. And I remember thinking it was just the coolest thing ever. I got to go in the locker room and interview the players. And I guess I was in seventh grade. And in any event, I did college journalism and high school and junior high. And I started off as a kind of political journalist or covering government. I went to Washington and did a bunch of different jobs working for local newspapers in their Washington bureaus, and then a magazine called the Washington Monthly, which is kind of policy oriented. And then my big break was Newsweek, where I became a Washington correspondent, and I always have to tell people, your age, that Newsweek used to be a really good magazine. And actually back in those days, the news magazines were quite important. They're really not now. So you have to use your imagination, but the news magazines really kind of set a lot of the tone of coverage. So it was a great time to be there. I mean, at the time I just complained about it, but now I realized that I was actually there during the golden age of news magazines. And, but it led to something. So I was just, being a journalist there in Washington, D.C., covering Congress and the White House and different policy issues. And toward the end of that, I had a kind of a understanding where I was noticing that whenever Newsweek or the other news magazines, Time Magazine, U.S. News, would put a faith-related topic on the cover, the sales would go up. And I started to do research on this, and it was sort of surprising to people. I was like, this is actually selling more than, health and celebrity and just about every other topic. And this started to fit into like a little bit of a narrative I was developing, a critique I was developing, I think, in my own head about what we now call the mainstream media, but which was that although it was very good at some things, it was really missing some of the most important things in people's lives. And I thought faith was the number one example of that. Like it was, it didn't quite fit the culture, or the kind of um, rules of behavior around journalism. And so I started this in starting in around 1998. I started this idea for what became BeliefNet, and it was going to and be a community and a website around faith, and it was multi-faith, all different faiths, and that was part of our calling card. It was like, we're not actually denominational, we're not coming from one faith. There's going to be a place where you can explore your own faith or learn about others. And we had great columnists, and I'm trying to remember who our LDS columnists were. Orson Scott Card was
Oh yeah.
one. Uh, I feel like Peggy Stack, maybe from the Salt Lake Tribune, was there. Anyway, um, and the reason that I ended up starting this, in addition to just seeing this like need among the audience, was that I had just gotten married. I'm Jewish, my wife is Protestant. So we were right in the thick of figuring out like how to deal with all that, and we had what kind of wedding we were going to have. We ended up with a ceremony that had a rabbi and a minister, and the minister was also a psychotherapist. So we thought we had the three major religions covered. And and it was interesting because I guess it was really the rabbi who said, like, you know, we're okay with you marrying a Christian woman, but you need to like confront up front like the issues that are going to come up. Go to couples therapy with it. So we went to a couples therapy thing with a uh, uh, that one was with a rabbi, and it was really useful actually because it kind of made us confront various things that I think couples like that always have to, but they often wait till the last minute. And we had to do it sort of up front. And then when we had our kids, which couple years later, same thing. Like, how are we going to raise the kids? What are and we just learned, and this was right around the time we were starting BeliefNet. So BeliefNet was very much fueled by what I was going through at home in terms of figuring out my own faith life, how we were going to raise our kids and things like that. And I became convinced that, my Judaism got deepened by learning about my wife's Christianity and vice versa. And the fact that we had to navigate all this stuff in a deliberate, conscious way was a real gift. And of course, it all fed back into the website and vice versa. And the website was really fun. I think we had we became the largest religion website on the internet. At one point, we were reaching through our newsletters 15 million people a day, I think. And two things that we invented actually along the way. One which I'm proud of, and the other one I'm not sure. Um, One was the idea of having comments on articles. Believe it or not, was not always a thing. We thought, hey, it would be really cool if we could have comments right on the article. So we did that. I think we were the first ones to do that. And of course, that led to the cesspool of flame wars and things like that. Not so much on our site, but subsequently. So that is more the dubious invention. The other one was online memorials, which we had a bunch of really interesting interactive things. My two favorites were, one was called Prayer Circles, which was a digital uh, kind of template where people would post a prayer and then other people would come and add their own prayers. And the other was online memorials. So anyways, a very creative time, the early days of the internet. This would be internet, dot 1.0 before Facebook and Google. And I did that for about 10 years. And then in the late 2000s, I uh, passed the baton. I guess the baton eventually ended up with you, with the BeliefNet. But I went on to have a stint at the Federal Communications Commission, which is the government agency that has in the past regulated like TV stations, things like that. But I did a report for them on the digital disruption, as it was being called then, and what its impact's going to be on the news business, and kind of came away from that thinking the problem's not going to be in national, it's going to be in local. And it kind of sent me down this path of um, focus on the local news crisis, which is what I've really spent the last 15 years doing. I started an organization called Report for America, which is like, I refer to it as a national service program, and it basically has people, and I encourage all of you to look into it when you're ready to graduate. Um, it places you in local newsrooms, gives mentors and training, and then they pay half the salary, and the newsroom pays the other half, or the community and the newsroom pays the other half. And it was really designed to try to get at what is a catastrophic collapse in local news. There's been, by our estimates, a 75% drop in the number of local journalists in the last 20, 25 years. And the consequences are just, for communities are horrible. I mean, it's not only do we have more corruption and less awareness for voters of who's even running and basic civic stuff, but there's a lot of evidence that the collapse of local news has exacerbated polarization and division and misinformation and the toxic culture that Governor Cox talks about all the time. Um, so that is my day job. So I've moved from Report for America to Rebuild Local News, which is the same issues, but we look at it from a public policy perspective of like, are there laws that can pass in state legislatures to help buck up community news outlets? So that's what I work on now. So it's sort of, I'm not exactly doing journalism myself. I'm more helping journalists to be able to survive and have jobs. And then on the question of John asked me to reflect on like how do as a career matter balance your faith interests, your faith and your career, or your values in your career. And I would say it's been a little bit different depending on what phase you're talking about. The BeliefNet phase was kind of easy. Like it was so lovely, it was all intertwined, and I got to go to a job where my job was to think about my faith life and other people's faith lives, and but that's pretty unusual. There are organizations that do really good work in the faith space. I'm on the board of Religion News Service, which is quite good, and so there are some like that. But stepping back more from the like, I guess there's two, and I'm not really often asked to reflect on it this way. So it's sort of it's interesting and challenging for me to think about it this way. And I was talking to my wife about it, and like the one way that I think the most important way that my faith uh, feeds into my career at this point is actually in thinking truth matters, um, which, I don't know how, I think probably lots of journalists would say that, but I think when I'm really pushed, to be totally honest, I really do think that there is an actual truth. Something actually happened in a certain way. And we humans may not actually ever get to the point of having a clear vision of what it was, but that didn't mean that there isn't a truth, and that the higher power knows what the truth is. And as journalists, we should aspire to getting as close to that as we can in an intellectually honest way. So that kind of keeps me grounded as thinking like the point is not to convince someone of an argument. The point is not to have your agenda win. The point is to try to get as close to truth as you can, because it's real, and it's something that we this is why I sometimes joke that journalists are the most religious people in America, even though actually journalists tend to be more secular. But I mean it in this way, like in a world where everyone thinks that truth is subjective and there's no such thing as truth, like there's two groups of people left who believe that truth is actually um, a reality, which is religious people and journalists, and they, in some ways couldn't be more different from each other. But at least on this front, and I think the other thing is just more like I don't know if this is my faith upbringing, but sort of the notion that like you go to work and I could never tolerate the idea that work was just the thing you did, to make money for your family and to do good works on the weekend. Like to me, it's all the same. It's all wrapped up. I could not imagine a career where I didn't feel like I was going to work every day helping the world a little bit. And you have to be realistic about how much you help, how much of a dent you're making. But I wouldn't have been able to think of, having a career any other way. Um, so that I think is the other, the other part of it. So why don't I stop there and see if any of you have any questions about any of this?
I have a question. Do I talk into like anything specific? Okay. How have you found to like balance your political views and your religious views? I mean, I know that they're supposed to say pretty separate, but in your case, since you've teetered between the two, how did you find a good balance?
Um, it's honestly it's been harder in recent years because of the attacks on the press. And so I feel like it's very hard for me to be neutral about the current administration because they're attacking the press. I mean, there's other reasons that I don't like the current administration, but in terms of your question, the on the other things we can kind of say, well, that's not our job to like figure that out, to pick sides. But it's a really interesting debate in our world, in the journalism world, is like, okay, we get that on everything else, but can you really be neutral on the existence of a free press? And I kind of think like, well, no, we probably can't be neutral on that. We can be neutral on everything else, but I think, there's a whole debate about objectivity and neutrality and fairness and what do those words mean. I, it's very complicated. I tend to use the word intellectual honesty as my kind of guidepost in the sense that you're never going to get rid of your political beliefs. You're never going to get rid of your religious beliefs, but you need to approach each assignment with a rigor toward really being open to where the facts take you. And that doesn't mean you won't end up with opinions. Like you might end up with very strong opinions as a result of that, but that you should go into it with a real open-mindedness of like almost like a scientist often has a hypothesis when they go into something. It's not like they go in as a blank slate, but the good ones adapt. Like if the evidence is like says, nope, your hypothesis is wrong, then you shift and keep trying. So that's um, the way I would answer it. But it is, I would say it's a much harder question now than it was 5 years ago because the journalism is so under attack from so many different directions that we feel like we have to defend ourselves. We have to it's not even ourselves. We have to defend our democracy, and that ends up seeming combative against the current administration. But there's probably no way around that.
We
I have a
see
question
people
for
online.
you. Um, when it comes to religious reporting, I staunchly believe that it deserves a place in journalism. Um, because it intersects with so much of our culture. And so religious people and non-religious people alike need people to prioritize religious reporting, so that we can understand the way that the world functions around us. Uh, when it comes to reporting, do you ever find yourself being deterred from reporting certain topics because the idea of religious reporting can sometimes be intimidating for me because people hold, even within, religion, people don't exist in a monolith and everyone has different convictions. I like the term that you use, instead of bias or neutrality, you use the term um, like honesty. And I like that approach because you can't really mitigate bias completely. So I want to know if there's ever been a situation where you felt like, this is really intimidating, but you felt like you went about it in a really honest way that did the public good.
Well, first on religious reporting, I of course totally agree. And BeliefNet was a bit of a luxury because it was all about religious reporting. I got to do it full time. When I was doing that, there were probably 40 newspapers that had local religion reporters at the time. I think there's maybe five now. So there's been part of what's happened with the local news collapse is a collapse in local religion reporting too. So, and we're trying to reverse that. Like when I was at Report for America, we made a big point of trying to create religion beats, and get them financed and placed because I think it's both really important and also just incredibly stupid for newspapers not to do it when it's a topic that's so important to their readers and they need to re-engage with their readers and build trust. Like I was like, I can't imagine a sort of faster way to try to rebuild trust with the community than to do better religion coverage. It's just, and it's not like people argue against that. I think people, kind of know, but they don't even have like someone to cover City Hall. So a religion reporter seems like a luxury, but that's sort of the world we're in. And that's why we have to do something very dramatic and trying to turn around the local news crisis. Um, you know, I think being a reporter is really hard. I think it's really hard to get things right. And I had the luxury or I the experience of working at a weekly magazine, which was a nice pace, I thought, because it was fast enough to be topical and on the news, but you had several days to report something. And I just remember thinking like the conclusions that I came to about things on Thursday were different than the ones I had on Monday. Like my views of reality changed over the course of just the week. And so I just remind people of that, of like how hard it is to get to the truth. And so imagine if you're someone who has to do it on a daily basis and you have 2 hours to get something. And I'm like, man, I couldn't even get to the truth like in day two. Like I needed, 4 days to get to the truth. So it's really hard to try to get as close to the truth as possible on a daily basis. We do the best we can, but we also should have some humility about it. And so, you know, uh, how did I deal with that uh, I think the main thing is if you're not sure, leave it out. Like it's sort of, and that's hard because you're under professional pressure to deliver what you know the reality. But if you're not confident in it, leave it out. And that's really tough because there's so much pressure. I mean, it's way worse now than it was when I pre-internet because internet, used to have daily daily pressure. Now you have by the minute. And so most places you'll work, it's like, where is it? But in the long run, you'll regret doing stuff that's inaccurate, even if it was fast. Um, and I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the other thing I would say is like if there's a story that you feel is really important, just don't give up on it. Figure out. It doesn't mean you're going to pitch editors as like, you should do this because it's the right thing to do. That's never going to be a persuasive argument with an editor. You have to come up with the angle that's going to be compelling for a reader. So that's on you to do that. I remember this is sort of a comical example, but when I was possibly the story that I did at Newsweek that had the most real world impact was a cover story I did at Newsweek about lead poisoning. And it was at that moment, people thought of lead poisoning as an inner city thing where that from eating, lead paint chips in public housing projects. And there was starting to be growing evidence that it was way more pervasive than that, both in pipes and just anyone who was in a house that had lead paint. And I couldn't get the editors to care about this. It just seemed, I don't know, dull or whatever. Finally, one of the editors said, I didn't say this, but it was such a kind of gross, but also brilliant. He pitched the story as saying, these kids are not going to be able to go to Bowdoin or Harvard. And that was the experience of like that particular editor. That was the way that he thought it was like the most horrifying version of it. And I remember thinking, God, really? Is that how stories get pitched? And like, but it worked. And like, oh, ooh, yes, that sounds very serious. So I was able to do this story that was really not about that, but it was all about the pervasive, an entire society of people who are having, mild forms of brain damage because of lead poisoning. And so, I mean, the lesson of that is like, as I said, you're never, if there's something that's important to you, just keep at it. But you can't just keep at it and making a moral pitch about it. Maybe that would work at the Deseret News, but probably nowhere else. And you have to be clever and creative and think about how are you gonna make that actually of interest to people, who are not looking at it from a moral point of view, but a practical point of view. But just be persistent about it.
I was just curious. So I worked at a local newsroom last summer, actually in West Virginia, and so most rural place. And I totally agree with religion reporting. That was something that we were trying to get started in the area. I'm just curious to see, like, with your vision with Report for America and like the other nonprofit you're involved in, do you have any ideas for like long-term engagement? Because once a reporter is like put in, probably want to leave, probably want to go back to the city, probably want to continue their career in other ways. So I'm just curious what you think with that. And then kind of along those same lines, it seems that the most effective newsrooms are covering local and national news. Deseret News is growing, New York Times is growing. They both have like this local aspect and then national aspect as well. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, on the first point, when you say engagement, you mean like actually staying in the community after your stint or whatever?
Yes.
Yeah, this is a real issue in rural America. I mean, even the business, a lot of our news deserts, the business models have collapsed in rural areas even more than anywhere else. And people want to move out of the town and don't want to stay there. Now, to some degree, there's always been a little element of this where people would go, work in a small town and work their way up the food chain, until they got to the big city. So that may just be like the way humans are. There's just only going to be a certain percent that want to live in a small town. But and so from a reporting point of view, we just encourage people to stick it out as long as you can, because it's very meaningful. You're going to get feedback from the community in a way that you won't once you're in a bigger city. You're going to have an impact in a way that's very powerful, and it's important. So if you want to do something important that's, can keep you motivated for a while, and then usually you stay there if you meet your spouse and you leave if you don't. That seems to be the way it tends to work. I jokingly said to one newspaper editor, like, if you want her to stay, fix her up with a local. Like that's gonna be what works so first. But I will say that the Report for America people, when we would interview them, they were really quite committed to the concept, to the service aspect of this. It's almost like we call that Report for America a service program. And I always used to do a riff at the beginning of the year of like, why do we call it a service program and not just, a journalism training program? And, it's 2 years, so it's not dissimilar from mission work in that sense. And it's basically, we try to make this as much about the mission as it is about the career skills. And we believe it, we believe that it is really important. And to me, that's also part of what might convince someone to stay longer is like the mission is the mission and it doesn't, change just because it's a smaller town. Now, the um, there's a whole, quite aside from the economic dilemmas, it's a really kind of best of times, worst of times in the local news world because the floor has completely fallen out of the business models. It's just collapsing everywhere. But there's also a tremendous amount of creativity and new models and new journalism models. And, so I'm actually not discouraging to folks that are going into journalism now at all. I mean, in fact, there's some really great places to work. It's a little harder to come by than it used to be, but it's sort of an exciting time. And you all are going to have to be the ones who figure out what the future model is, which is daunting, but also exciting. It's not like when I went into work at Newsweek, it was this existing big behemoth that it was exciting to work at, but you didn't feel like you could change it or change journalism in any fundamental way. You all are going to be able to change journalism in pretty fundamental ways. And that's both, daunting and exciting too. What was your second question, Madeline? I'm sorry. I went on so long about the first one.
No, you're good. It was more of like a clarifying point. You answered the question about like how to keep reporters kind of engaged. And then you also answered the second question about like how do you maintain user engagement, especially at a local level where local news might not be as exciting as national news.
Oh, the national part. Yeah. I mean, I think the reason the New York Times has succeeded financially is they stopped caring about local. They just actually went all in on being a national publication, and it's worked phenomenally well. I think so. I actually think the New Time, Deseret News may be a little different, but I think most of the ones that are doing well are doubling down on local and not trying to do too much national. Like, because national you can find anywhere else. So there's no particular reason to go to the local newspaper to get national. Now, you can overstate it because one of the nice things, 20 years ago when you had strong regional newspapers, was you could have a local perspective on national topics, and you could have, how if I were editing a newspaper, a city paper now, I would do national, but I would have it be really disciplined in being about the local angle on national things. So, so there's a budget showdown. Well, how are the budget cuts going to affect Provo or Salt Lake City or something like that? So, but it's a tough call because if you go too narrow, like there's a bunch of places that nonprofit newsrooms that started off doing just investigative work and accountability reporting because they thought appropriately that was an incredibly big gap that has fallen apart when local news collapsed. But the problem is like no one really wants to read a website that's just investigative pieces. It's just not that interesting. It's not that compelling. So that forced them to kind of recalibrate like, oh, shoot, we actually still have to worry about reader engagement and how to reach folks like that. And I would say the jury's still out on what the right, mix of things like that is.
Yes, I have a question. So I am curious about the work you're doing with Rebuild Local News, like specifically the public policy part of it. And I was wondering if you could share some learnings that you've had, like are there laws that could help us, or how can we be using our voices to help rebuild that?
Ooh, I love that. I love that question. And I'll give you a general one. I'm gonna give you like a really specific Utah idea too. So, obviously the riddle here is how do you do public policy to help local news without, the government being able to use the power of the purse to manipulate the press and undermine the First Amendment. Like you could totally imagine if you had the governor handing out grants to local news organizations, it would be very easy for him or her to reward and punish news organizations that are giving positive or negative coverage. So you have to be really careful with this, how you do it, but there are ways of doing it. So Illinois passed a law last year that provided essentially tax subsidies for news organizations that hire local reporters. So it's a very objective standard. There's no like looking at what the quality of the content is or the topics. It's just as long as it's local, then they get financial support. So that's one thing. New York City did a thing where they said the government spends, in New York's case, a lot of money to advertise various things, public transit or health benefits or things like that, tourism. And so they said, well, let's instead of you spending all of that on Google or Facebook or the New York Times, we're going to require you to spend half of it with local media. And that shifted $72 million in 5 years to local media in New York City. So that's another one. Fellowships, like Report for America in Washington State, California, New Mexico, the universities have been basically running programs like that and then got state money for it. So the two ideas for Utah are, oh, and then there's a fourth one, which actually is the one I think would probably work best in Utah, but other states are looking at it too. It's a subsidy for small businesses that advertise in local news. So it's kind of this interesting bank shot where this financial support's actually going to restaurants and hardware stores and things like that if they advertise in local news. So both get the benefit, but it's the small business that's deciding where it goes, not the government. So that is a kind of neat way of doing it. I've been trying to rustle up support in Utah to do something like that. The other possibility is the fellowship thing. You could have a version of like what they're doing in other states run through, Utah Valley or University of Utah or BYU or something like that, where it's administered by the university and that places professional journalists. It would give you guys all a better shot at getting local journalism jobs if they did that. So tell your dean to do that. And I think that, our argument is that this actually also fits into, Governor Cox's strong view that, social media is leading to kind of poisoning communities and leading to division and polarization because we think that one of the antidotes to polarization is local news, is community news. National news tends to be more partisan. Social media tends to have more misinformation. Local news is more grounded in communities. And so we want to try to, at some point, make a push in Utah to do one of those two ideas, either the fellowship run through the universities or the small business support for local news, but with a broader argument to it of this is not just good for, the news industry, it's good for the communities of Utah because it will help to counter this division and polarization and toxicity from the platforms.
I have another question. I know that you mentioned you kind of started like comments on articles. How would you ensure that your audience knew that their comments were being like heard and like I guess just like appreciated in the sense with I know that you also said you got like sometimes over 15 million views on a certain article or every day or whatever. So with that, did like a lot of comments come in, and how would you respond to those comments? Would you just kind of let them sit there? Would you make a point to respond to them?
Well, I guess the main thing is we had moderators, human being moderators. And, it was a religion site, a multi-faith site. So you can imagine like amazing conversations in about every possible religion, faith practice, spiritual journeys, politics. Like it was really, and as you can imagine, probably some of those can get heated too. But there was a real art to moderating those to have them not go off the rails. And my frustration with the social media companies is like, well, that would be very expensive to, have that kind of like oversight. It was like, we're a little website compared to you all, and we prioritized having moderation so that it wouldn't go off the rails. You're the richest companies in the history of the world. You can figure out a way of doing that. And it's not easy because the tendency for people to like devolve into attacks is real. We had one trick that we did, which was first of all, our terms of service were that, you had to be respectful and civil to each other. So, and if you weren't, we would take you out. Like and we said like, free speech does not require us to allow every comment to be posted here. That's not what free speech is. Free speech is the government can't censor you. BeliefNet can censor you. BeliefNet is allowed to say, no, we're going to have a community that is civil. And if you're not, here's the rules. We state them right up front. If you're not going to do it, plenty of other places for you to post your comments. Now, there were one of the tough things, and I think this is still true, is that if you remove someone, they tend to come back angrier. So there was always a real finesse to how you would deal with particularly irate people. We found that the best way to deal with them, we created this area called, what was it called? I think Doctrine and Dissent. And it was basically like the place we would put people who just really wanted to fight with each other. So we didn't kick them off the site. We just put them in a room with each other, and they, went at each other, and like it was ugly, but it got them out of the like prayer area. It got them out of the areas where people were trying to really have sensitive conversations, often about really important personal things, where they were trying to be vulnerable with each other. And at least it got the trolls into another room. So I guess troll wasn't even a word then, but I guess we kind of created special troll rooms where the trolls could like attack each other. And I guess it's like it's an old-fashioned notion, but I think online communities need cultivation and moderation and tending and things like that. And I know the platforms don't really do that. It's all algorithmic plus, violating. But we put a lot of time and effort into setting up conversations, into putting question prompts that we thought would take people into constructive directions, things like that. It was like a lot of thought went into how to have it's like if you were doing a book group or a Bible study or something like that, you'd think about how are you going to structure this, and what are the question prompts, and what are the rules of engagement in terms of how you want everyone gets to talk or things like that. And online communities, when they're healthy, have some of that.
Steve, I think Julie Rose asked a question. I think we'll end on that. So feel free to answer that, and then any concluding remarks that you may have.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't have my chat thing open. Any advice for journalists looking to be independent? Ways for local reporting, doing it solo, not as part of an official newsroom, influencer, independent journalist? It's a really good question. And, a lot of us are hoping that these models work. So a couple things, one of the things that we've seen. so far is that a lot of the influencers and Substacks that have worked well enough to provide a living for you, for a person, have tended to be national. There have not been as many examples of people doing that locally. And I think that's just a matter of scale. Like if you're covering the Provo School Board, there's just only so many people who are going to sign up to your Substack, and it's not going to be quite enough to earn a living, unfortunately. But I think that there really is an appetite for local information, and that if you come up with ways of being engaging about it, and it may be more video oriented, it may be more, a little more, TikTok influenced, but with real reporting and local high quality content. The good thing is that you don't need to earn enough money to support a whole newsroom. You just need to earn enough money to support yourself because the technology is so cheap. Like you can just plug into Substack or plug into TikTok or plug into something else like that. And so you have to, now that's easier said than done to earn enough to have your own salary. And I think unfortunately Substack has a model, and there are people who make a living at Substack. I don't know that there's a ton of them that make a living doing local on Substack, but there's some. And the other thing I would say is that it's not, I think increasingly it's not going to be either or, like on your own or in a newsroom. I was just at a conference where we had a whole like half a day about how traditional newsrooms should partner with individual influencers. And that may be the way to go, is because the newsrooms think that individual influencers have something that they don't have. And it's often true. Like they're building relationships with the audience in a deeper, more creative way. So if you do that, you can then go to the local newsroom and say, why don't you pay me? I will continue to be independent, but I'll be on a contract with you too. And you can pull my work into what you're doing. And that's good for the traditional newspaper. It's good for you by providing an extra layer of revenue. Because otherwise, I'm a little afraid that, it's going to end up being, if you want to be an independent journalist, your only choices are you can be national, and if you're really good, you probably can make a living at it, or it's a hobby. It's like you have a job, you have another job. That's not the end of the world, by the way. Like if you're lucky enough to have a job that's like a good half-time or three-quarter time job, and the other part of your time you're covering your community, and it's almost like a civic, instead of volunteering at the PTA, you're doing the local news organization. That's not a horrible life. But I would love to see, these business models work where, being a local influencer can help someone make a living. And by the way, that's part of what we're trying to do with public policy, because we're trying to, like, one of the things we like about the idea of having a subsidy that's in the tax code is, in theory, if you're an influencer and you're doing actual journalism, you could get $25,000 from the government too. And that might be enough to put you over the top to make a living at it. So it's like, this is obviously sort of the Wild West right now. This is like very new. I wouldn't say, I've been a little worried how many local examples there are. I keep going to these conferences where they have influencers and they're making phenomenal amounts of money, and they have amazingly large audiences, and none of them are doing local. But because I always complain about that, I have been given examples of local people who are making it work. So I do think it's possible, but it's just harder.
Final question. Who wants that?
Anybody want to?
Oh,
yeah, that's great. I guess I'm just curious, and like, if maybe I missed it in the beginning, but just like kind of what's so appealing to you about like covering faith and covering religion, like personally to you, like why is it something that you're passionate about and like that you feel is like worthy and deserving of like a national audience, I guess?
The way I used to, like, when I was trying to explain to other people and pitch people on why this ought to get covered better is I would say, I hate to tell you this, but the most important news event in most people's lives is not the Iowa caucus. It's the birth of their child or the death of their parent or, a financial crisis. Like these are the true news events in people's lives. And they don't, in the normal confines of journalism, they don't fit. Well, what's new about that? What's unusual about, so you had a kid, that's great, but that's not news. Doing faith coverage enables you to get at, I think, some of the most important things in people's lives through a different door. And so it's both literally the faith aspects, your relationship with God or your prayer life or things like that. But even when it's not that overtly religious, when you're talking about, the nitty-gritty work of faith communities is often around these topics that are deeply personal to people and meaningful to people. So, to me, it's I don't know, it just seems like, why wouldn't you? This is the most interesting, important, material that there is. It seems so obvious to me that it ought to be well covered. I think a lot of the reason it isn't is just that you have to be kind of creative about it, and it doesn't fit the normal conventions of news. Because otherwise, if it's all about, oh, you got to do something new, or it's only about conflict, then your religion coverage just becomes about scandals in church hierarchy or whatever, which should be part of what religion coverage is, but it shouldn't be the entirety of it. It should also be about people's actual lived faith lives and what how it plays out. And so to me, on a personal level, it's just more interesting. It feeds me personally, but I just also think it's just better. It's better journalism on some level.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steven. Anything else you and Rod want to wrap up?
Yeah. Steven, do you have any final comments you want to leave this group with?
Well, you all should definitely, are you juniors or seniors or a mix?
Definitely a mix.
And are you all journalism people, or some of you are comms, PR? Not there's anything wrong with that. Both my parents were in public relations, so I'm not snobby about it. But so obviously you should check out Report for America for sure. And then I'm going to come back to you all when we start working on this Utah project, because I think you could be very persuasive, in the legislature about why this is important to the future of Utah. I don't know if all of you are from Utah, but I'm assuming many of you probably are. And, both in terms of having better religion coverage in the state, which would be one of the goals, but also just stronger communities and better understanding of each other. A lot of this is about well, why is local news important? It's part of it is dispense with the national stereotyping of people and caricatures, and have journalism that actually reflects the real lives of people and neighbors. So it's not about accountability reporting. In some ways, it's about people coming to know their own community and their own neighbors in a way that is humanizing instead of dehumanizing. So I'm going to call on you at the appropriate moment if you're interested to try to help with this effort.
Steven, thank you. Let's give him a.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's really fun to be able to kind of reflect on these topics. I don't normally get asked about them.